Jack Turner's farm had always been his refuge, a sprawling, sunlit property in rural Willow Creek that had been passed down for generations. The old farmhouse, surrounded by fields of wildflowers and cattle pastures, was more than just a building. It was the heart of Jack's life and a living testament to his family's legacy of hard work and independence. Every morning, as the sun painted the sky in shades of orange and pink, Jack would step onto his wraparound porch, sip his coffee, and survey the land that he loved with every fiber of his being. A former military man who had traded uniform for overalls, Jack was known in Willow Creek as a down-to-earth, principled rancher. He managed his land with care and devotion, tending to his crops, looking after his animals, and preserving the traditions that had made his family proud for decades. His livestock, especially his free-roaming goats and cows, were as much a part of the landscape as the ancient oak trees that dotted the property. But all was not well on the farm. Over the past few months, whispers had grown into shouts about an overzealous homeowners association that sought to impose a rigid, modern standard on even the most historic properties. At the center of this bureaucratic crusade was Kerren Miller, the self-appointed queen of the HOA. Always impeccably dressed in crisp skirts, high heels, and with a clipboard clutched tightly in hand, Kerren believed that every property had to conform to her exacting vision of suburban perfection. The spark that ignited the conflict came on a sweltering summer afternoon. Jack had been busy in the barn preparing for an upcoming harvest when he heard raised voices outside. Rushing to investigate, he discovered a surprising scene. Kerren, accompanied by several of her equally prim HOA cronies, was hosting what appeared to be a wedding reception right in the middle of his farm. Tables had been set up along the dirt driveway, white linens were spread out, and twinkling fairy lights hung haphazardly from old oak branches. It was as if the HOA had commandeered his property for a celebration, without asking for permission. "Jack, isn't it wonderful?" Kerren cooed as she approached him, a self-satisfied smile playing on her lips. "We're here to celebrate community spirit. Your farm is the perfect venue, open, natural, and full of character. But you must understand, proper protocol requires that all events be authorized by the HOA. And since you've been neglectful of our standards, this is a necessary corrective measure." Jack's heart sank. His farm was his sanctuary, his home that he had nurtured with decades of hard work. "Kerren, you can't just host a wedding on my property without asking," he replied, his voice a mixture of disbelief and simmering anger. "This isn't a community park. It's my farm, my livelihood, and my family's legacy." Kerren's eyes flashed with entitlement as she held up a final warning notice printed on pristine paper. "The rules apply to everyone, Jack. Your property does not meet the approved standards for hosting events, and if you don't allow us to make the necessary improvements, you'll face fines and further enforcement." Her tone brooked no argument. Neighbors who had gathered discreetly behind barns and hedges watched in stunned silence as the confrontation unfolded. For Jack, this was more than an inconvenient misunderstanding. It was a blatant assault on his rights as a property owner. The wedding reception, complete with buffet tables and soft music, was an egregious overreach by the HOA, and it threatened to undermine the very essence of what his farm represented. That evening, as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, Jack sat on his porch with a heavy heart and a burning resolve. The final warning lay on the table before him, a symbol of the HOA's relentless intrusion into his personal affairs. He vowed that no one, least of all an entitled bureaucrat like Kerren, would dictate how he managed his home. The battle lines were drawn. A man determined to protect his legacy versus an HOA enforcer intent on imposing her standards by any means necessary. The next morning, Jack awoke to a disquieting surprise. Taped to the farmhouse door was another official envelope bearing the HOA seal. With trepidation, he opened it to reveal a $750 fine for violating community event regulations, and a stern warning that any future unauthorized use of his property would result in harsher penalties. The fine was loaded with dense legal jargon and veiled threats, an unmistakable message that the HOA, under Kerren's watch, intended to enforce conformity at any cost. Before Jack could even absorb the magnitude of the fine, He stepped outside and found Kerren waiting near the driveway. Standing with arms crossed and a smirk on her face, she said, "Good morning, Jack. I trust you've read the notice. Remember, our community standards apply to every property, including yours." Jack's response was steady and resolute. "Kerren, my farm is my livelihood. I have the right to manage my property the way I've always done. Your fine is nothing more than an attempt to force me into compliance with your arbitrary rules." Kerren's tone remained cold as she replied, "If you don't bring your property into line, further action will be taken. We all must adhere to the rules, Jack." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Jack both infuriated and determined. Later that morning, while Jack inspected his property, he noticed a nondescript van idling near the entrance. Two inspectors in official uniforms stepped out, clipboards in hand, and began measuring his driveway, photographing his barn, and scrutinizing every inch of his land. His loyal dogs barked at the intruders as Jack watched, his heart pounding with indignation. Determined not to be bullied, Jack activated his security system and began documenting every detail. He snapped photos of the inspectors at work, recorded fragments of their conversation on his phone, and carefully logged the time and specifics of the intrusion. Each click of the camera shutter was a silent declaration. His property would not be violated without consequence. That afternoon, in the quiet of his barn's modest office, Jack compiled the evidence into a detailed dossier. He drafted a formal complaint to the local zoning office, citing long-standing agricultural exemptions and property rights that protected him from such arbitrary interference. His complaint was not only a legal challenge, it was a proclamation of his right to preserve his family's legacy and manage his farm without interference from the HOA's overreaching regulations. Word of the fine and the intrusive inspection quickly spread through Cedar Valley. At local feed stores and community gatherings, neighbors began sharing their own stories of arbitrary fines and unauthorized inspections. Slowly but surely, a collective dissatisfaction emerged. As dusk settled and the cicadas began their nightly chorus, Kerren reappeared at Jack's property. Under the soft glow of a single porch light, she delivered her ultimatum. "Jack, you have 48 hours to comply with our standards and secure your property appropriately, or additional penalties will be imposed." Her voice was unyielding, every word challenge. Jack's reply was calm and resolute. "I will maintain my property as it's always been my way. My home is my sanctuary, and I won't let you dictate how I live." With that, he closed the door on another day of escalating tension, aware that the battle for his farm was only just beginning. In the days that followed Kerren's ultimatum, the situation on Jack's farm escalated dramatically. What began as a fine and a cursory inspection quickly transformed into a full-scale campaign of harassment. Neighbors whispered that Kerren had allowed her HOA friends to walk freely across private properties, using such invasions as leverage for further fines. Rumors spread that she even tried to milk one of Jack's prize cows without permission, an egregious act that symbolized her total disregard for private property. One gloomy afternoon, while Jack was repairing a section of his fence, his longtime neighbor, Bill, pulled up beside him. "Jack, you're not alone," Bill confided in a hushed tone. "I've heard Kerren's been trespassing on other farms too, parking her car in driveways, walking through private fields, and even trying to take livestock for her own purposes. They say the fines collected are funneled straight into her personal projects." Bill's words resonated deeply with Jack, affirming that this was not an isolated incident, but a systemic abuse of power. Determined to expose the full extent of the HOA's corruption, Jack embarked on a covert investigation. He made discreet trips to the county clerk's office to review HOA records, attended board meetings incognito, and recorded whispered conversations among frustrated neighbors. Every piece of evidence he gathered painted a damning picture. Kerren was exploiting her authority to control property owners and enrich herself rather than protect the community. Late one stormy night, as rain hammered against the barn roof and lightning illuminated the dark skies, Jack sat in his office, poring over photocopies of financial ledgers and anonymous notes. He compiled a detailed dossier that documented irregularities in the HOA's enforcement practices, mysterious deductions, unexplained transfers, and forged documents. With each new discovery, his resolve hardened. This was not just about a single infraction. It was about a systematic abuse of power that needed to be stopped. Word of Jack's investigation began to circulate quietly through Cedar Valley. At a secret meeting in the back room of a local feed store, several aggrieved property owners recounted their own experiences with intrusive inspections and arbitrary fines. An elderly farmer tearfully described how a minor deviation in his fence alignment had resulted in a crippling penalty, while another admitted he'd been forced to pay voluntary contributions that never reached any communal fund. The collective outrage was palpable, and Jack's dossier quickly became a rallying point for those determined to stand up to the HOA's tyranny. Recognizing that the stakes were higher than ever, Jack upgraded his security system. He installed additional cameras along the perimeter of his property and ensured that every unauthorized intrusion, every instance of trespassing, was captured in high definition. His loyal dogs patrolled the grounds, their watchful eyes a constant reminder that his property was not a public domain. Every detail was logged, every moment recorded, all to be used as evidence in the fight for justice. Under the oppressive threat of further fines and the possibility of legal action to seize privately owned land, the tension in the community grew. Kerren's tactics became increasingly aggressive. In a series of curt, official letters, she warned that continued noncompliance would result in severe penalties. The residents of Cedar Valley felt the weight of these threats, and it became clear that if the abuse continued, no one would be safe from her arbitrary power. One stormy night, as thunder rolled overhead, Jack reviewed his dossier one final time. The evidence was overwhelming, and he resolved that it was time to take his case public. With determination in his eyes, he reached out to local journalists, handing over copies of the records, photographs, and videos that documented every instance of the HOA's overreach. Standing in the rain-soaked darkness outside his farmhouse, Jack vowed that he would no longer tolerate the violation of his rights. This battle was about preserving his legacy and ensuring that every property owner could live without fear of arbitrary interference. The simmering conflict reached its breaking point one sweltering morning when Jack arrived at his farmhouse to find an astonishing scene. Kerren had hosted a wedding on his farm without permission. Tables and chairs had been set up on his front lawn, and a lavish buffet spread, complete with a beautifully decorated cake and twinkling lights, had been arranged in the center of his property. Guests mingled casually, seemingly oblivious to the fact that they were on private land. Jack's blood boiled at the sight. Not only had Kerren and her entourage trespassed on his property, but they had also commandeered his land for a celebration, disregarding his rights entirely. Determined to send a clear message that his property was off limits, Jack devised a plan that was equal parts ingenious and unapologetic. He would unleash his herd of goats on the buffet table. Goats, known for their mischievous nature and insatiable appetite for almost anything, were Jack's trusty companions and an integral part of his farm's charm. He knew that their presence could disrupt any event, and today it was the perfect opportunity for retribution. After a brief moment to collect his thoughts, Jack sprang into action. He hurried to the barn, where his goats were tethered and grazing peacefully. With a few sharp commands and a flourish of determination, he released the goats from their pens. The goats, sensing the excitement, immediately bounded toward the buffet area, their eyes gleaming with mischief. The chaos that ensued was almost cinematic. As the goats reached the buffet table, they began to sample everything in sight, tipping over platters, nibbling on the carefully arranged cake, and sending the guests into a flurry of alarm. Laughter and shouts filled the air as Kerren, standing near the entrance in her signature high heels and clipboard, found herself utterly flustered. Her plans for a perfect wedding were crumbling before her eyes as the goats wreaked havoc on the buffet, scattering decorations and turning the elegant spread into a scene of delightful pandemonium. Neighbors who had gathered in the distance couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity of it all. Social media buzzed with live footage, and soon, The image of Kerren's exasperated face amid the goat-induced chaos became a viral sensation. For Jack, it was the ultimate act of defiance, a way to reclaim his property and assert his rights in the most unexpected yet effective manner. Later that day, at a specially convened HOA meeting held at the local community center, Jack presented the evidence. He played videos of the goat's rampage, the overturned tables, and most importantly, Kerren's flustered attempts to restore order. The room fell silent as homeowners and board members absorbed the undeniable proof of Kerren's repeated overreach. "Today," Jack declared, "I've shown that my property is not a playground for your arbitrary events. When you trespass and misuse my land, nature herself will respond. My farm is my legacy, and I will defend it no matter what." His words were met with resounding applause and nods of solidarity from those who had long suffered under Kerren's rule. Kerren, red-faced and visibly shaken, tried to insist that the wedding was a community event sanctioned by the HOA. But her protests were drowned out by the evidence and the support for Jack's stance. The blocked exit, the unauthorized wedding, and now the goat rampage had transformed Jack's personal grievance into a symbol of resistance, a rallying cry for every property owner in Cedar Valley. That afternoon, as Jack surveyed his now chaotic farm, he knew that this act of defiance would mark a turning point in the battle against arbitrary power. The goats had done more than disrupt a wedding. They had reclaimed the dignity of his property and sent a clear message. His land was his own, and he would not allow anyone, not even Kerren, to dictate how it was used. Reeling from the public embarrassment of the goat incident, Kerren was desperate to regain control. That night, under the cover of darkness, she gathered a small group of loyal HOA enforcers and, armed with a clipboard and a determined scowl, headed to Jack's farm with a final, aggressive plan. Her goal was to storm the property, reclaim her right to dictate community standards, and force Jack into submission. Kerren and her team crept toward the farmhouse, their footsteps muffled by the soft earth. They intended to block access to the property and, in a show of force, clear out any remaining evidence of Jack's defiance. However, what they hadn't anticipated was that Jack had further fortified his defenses. High-definition security cameras had been strategically installed around the property, and his loyal goats, and even his dogs, were on high alert. As Kerren's group reached the edge of the field, a sudden, loud alarm shattered the silence. The motion sensors, triggered by the approaching enforcers, blared a piercing warning that sent the intruders into a panic. In the ensuing chaos, one of Jack's dogs barked ferociously, and the enforcers scattered. The security cameras captured every moment. Kerren's enraged face, the frantic scrambling of her team, and her desperate attempts to regain control as the alarm continued to blare. The next day, at an emergency HOA meeting convened at the community center, Jack took the stage once again. With calm authority, he presented the security footage to a packed room of homeowners and board members. The video, showing Kerren's group caught in the midst of a chaotic retreat, was damning. "This footage," Jack declared, "proves that Kerren's tactics are not only overreaching, but they border on criminal. My property is my home, and I will not allow it to be violated by force." Kerren, red-faced and visibly shaken, tried to insist that her actions were in the interest of community safety. But her protest was met with a chorus of disapproval from the audience. The evidence was clear. Her final desperate move had backfired, further eroding her credibility and authority. By the end of the meeting, the atmosphere was charged with a renewed sense of determination. The community had seen enough. Kerren's threats and invasive actions had pushed the residents to the brink, and they were now united in their demand for accountability. Jack's evidence, meticulously gathered and now laid bare, was the turning point that would seal her fate. That night, as Jack sat on his porch reviewing the footage, he felt a mix of sorrow for the losses his property had endured and satisfaction at the progress made. He vowed to pursue every legal avenue to hold Kerren accountable for her repeated transgressions. Her final, desperate move had not only exposed her disregard for the rights of property owners, but had united the community in a fight for justice that would soon lead to irreversible consequences for her reign of terror. In the wake of Kerren's exposed misdeeds and the resounding public outcry, Cedar Valley underwent a remarkable transformation. What had begun as isolated acts of unauthorized weddings and invasive inspections soon evolved into a full-scale rebellion against arbitrary authority. Neighbors, fed up with Kerren's repeated trespassing and exploitation of private property, began rallying together in protests, town hall meetings, and community forums. Their shared determination to reclaim their rights spread like wildfire. At a particularly charged meeting held at the local civic center, long-suffering residents took turns recounting the various abuses they had endured, unauthorized events on their properties, unjust fines, and the humiliation of having their land exploited for others' purposes. The room buzzed with anger and solidarity as each testimony underscored the oppressive nature of Kerren's rule. The evidence, along with Jack's own courageous acts of defiance, like blocking his farmhouse exit and unleashing his goats, had united the community in a common cause. Under immense public pressure, the HOA board found itself isolated. In a dramatic, historic vote broadcast live to the community, the board members, many of whom had grown disillusioned with Kerren's heavy-handed tactics, unanimously voted to remove her from her position as HOA president. The decision was met with thunderous applause and tears of relief from the assembled homeowners. For the first time in years, residents felt empowered to reclaim their autonomy and dignity. Simultaneously, local authorities launched an independent investigation into the HOA's practices. Auditors uncovered a tangled web of misappropriated funds, forged documents, and systematic abuses designed to enrich a select few at the expense of property owners. Headlines in local newspapers declared HOA tyranny toppled and community triumph over injustice, and the public celebrated the dawn of a new era. For Jack, the removal of Kerren was a deeply personal victory. His brave acts, reporting her for trespassing, exposing her unauthorized wedding, and unleashing his goats on the buffet table, had ignited a movement that not only reclaimed his property, but also set a powerful precedent for every homeowner in Cedar Valley. As he sat on his porch each evening, watching the sun cast long, golden shadows across his land, he felt a profound sense of vindication. His farm, though scarred by months of conflict, now stood as a proud symbol of resilience and the triumph of community over arbitrary power. In the weeks that followed, a new democratically elected HOA was established under leaders who promised transparency, fairness, and respect for individual rights. The oppressive rules and invasive practices were dismantled, replaced by guidelines that celebrated local traditions while safeguarding private property. The community's collective voice had prevailed, and the dark legacy of Kerren's rule began to fade into memory. With the community united and the damning evidence of Kerren's repeated violations in hand, legal authorities moved swiftly to dismantle the corrupt HOA structure. Bolstered by Jack's comprehensive dossier, including high-definition security footage, photographs of unauthorized events, and meticulous logs of every infraction, the county launched a full-scale investigation into the HOA's practices. The inquiry revealed a labyrinth of financial misappropriations, forged documents, and systemic abuses that had long exploited property owners. A series of class action lawsuits was promptly filed on behalf of the affected residents. In a landmark courtroom session, a judge scrutinized the overwhelming evidence and delivered a verdict that sent shockwaves through Cedar Valley. The HOA was to be dissolved immediately, its assets frozen pending further legal action, and its leadership held accountable for their crimes. The state attorney general established an independent task force to oversee the restructuring of neighborhood associations, ensuring that such tyranny would never again take root. Local media exploded with the story. Headlines blared HOA tyranny dismantled and community triumph over corruption, while televised reports captured the jubilant reactions of residents who had long suffered under arbitrary fines and invasive practices. Jack's steadfast resistance and his creative countermeasures became a powerful symbol of accountability, inspiring property owners everywhere to stand up for their rights. The legal verdict was a resounding affirmation that no one was above the law, and that collective action could dismantle even the most entrenched systems of oppression. Former board members faced intense scrutiny, and several were indicted on charges related to fraud and extortion. The dissolution of the old HOA marked not only the end of an era of fear, but also the beginning of a new chapter in community governance, one built on transparency, fairness, and respect for individual rights. As the legal proceedings against the corrupt HOA reached their climax, Kerren Miller's personal world began to collapse. Once the self-appointed enforcer of community standards, she was now exposed as a bully whose authority was built on intimidation and greed. Public scrutiny intensified as evidence of her repeated trespassing, and even her unauthorized use of other residents' resources, like hosting weddings on private properties, was paraded before the community and in court. Her bank accounts were frozen, and assets that had once symbolized her power were seized to cover fines and legal fees. In a final dramatic vote, the HOA board forced her resignation amid a storm of public outrage. Gossip spread like wildfire through Cedar Valley. Neighbors whispered about her ruined reputation, and local newspapers chronicled her fall from grace. In a bitter twist of irony, Kerren was later forced to accept a low-level position as an assistant property manager for another HOA, an organization that prided itself on strict adherence to the very rules she had once flouted. One brisk morning, as Jack drove past a modest office building where Kerren now worked in plain, unassuming attire, he couldn't help but smile and murmur under his breath, "I hope you like following the rules." That wry remark quickly became the talk of the town, a final, poetic mic drop on her once dominant reign. Interviews with former board members and previously intimidated residents painted a unanimous picture. Kerren's era of tyranny was over, and her personal collapse was a powerful symbol of accountability. Her downfall served as a stark reminder that unchecked power ultimately crumbles when held accountable by a united community. For Jack, witnessing Kerren's ruin was deeply vindicating. His farm, though scarred by months of conflict, now stood as a proud monument to resilience and the triumph of justice over oppression. Every act of trespassing and every unauthorized intrusion had been documented and used to dismantle her reign. Kerren's fall had become a symbol of the community's reclaimed rights, a testament to Jack's unwavering determination to protect his home. In the months following the dissolution of the corrupt HOA and Kerren's spectacular downfall, Cedar Valley began to heal. The oppressive shadow of arbitrary fines and invasive inspections gave way to a renewed sense of unity, empowerment, and celebration of individual rights. Jack's farm, now secure and thriving under his careful stewardship, stood as a living testament to resilience and the enduring spirit of those who refused to be bullied. At a festive community picnic held on a crisp autumn afternoon, neighbors gathered to mark the dawn of a new era, one defined by fairness, transparency, and respect for private property. Laughter and music filled the open fields as families shared home-cooked meals, and children played around the barns. In a light-hearted moment, a local artist unveiled a humorous mural depicting a red-faced Kerren being chased by a flock of goats that had invaded a buffet table, an irreverent final mic drop on her reign of terror. Seated on his porch with a steaming cup of coffee in hand, Jack watched the festivities with quiet satisfaction. The painful memories of unauthorized weddings, trespassing, and invasive HOAs had given way to hope and collective empowerment. When a longtime friend approached him with a mock HOA violation notice for excessive trespassing on private property, Jack simply grinned and replied, "They really tried." In that serene moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon and bathed Cedar Valley in warm, golden hues, the legacy of Kerren's oppressive rule faded into memory. The community had reclaimed its rights, and Jack's steadfast defense of his farm had become a powerful reminder that true power lies not in enforcing conformity, but in standing up for one's home and heritage. Fade to black.